In this .NET MVC core tutorial, I'm going to code a trip log application with a database that really highlights a couple of .NET features, the view model. And so that was an interesting concept when I first learned about it. You know, we have model view controller architecture, and then you have this new thing called a view model. So I'm going to really try and explain the benefits of a view model as I'm building this out, and temp data. What is temp data and how is it useful in an application? And so what we're building is a trip log, and you can kind of see here trips pulled out of a database. And as I add a trip, we're going to have this wizard-like feature, of course, with validation, where you can add a trip with start and end dates. Of course, we can make these calendar fields, and we can add optional location info about, you know, phone number, email address. Those are optional and things to do. And so again, what we're going to highlight here, view models and temp data. And so let's get into it. So I'm going to start up Visual Studio 2022. Of course, you need the ASP.NET template installed. We're going to create a new project. You're going to search for ASP.NET Core. So I kind of drop down C# web in my drop downs, and you could select ASP.NET Core Web App Model View Controller. Right here, I've got it on recent project templates, and I'm going to say trips. First thing I'm going to do is kind of get this wired up for my database. Default settings are fine. And let's bring this over. All right, now to get started, let's look at app settings. And so I'm going to minimize my Solution Explorer. I'm going to auto hide it, just kind of bring this into maybe 150% view. I'm going to add a connection string to my database. And so I'm going to put a comma right here and put in my connection string to my database. And so I'm going to call this trip log, I'm going to call it trip log CS for my trip log connection string. This is the name of my connection string. Server is my local DB that is installed when you install from the ASP.NET installer. And the database, we're going to call it trip log. Okay, the rest of these values, trusted connection, and multiple active result sets. These are just a standard connection string for you. And so let's go ahead and save this now. The next thing we need to do is create our DB context. So this is our connection string to use our DB context. Let's go ahead and create that DB context file. We need to go ahead and install tools, entity framework tools. And so we need to install entity framework. So let's manage our packages. I'm going to browse. So the tool packages are Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. Let's install this. And we get the green check mark there. And let's clear that out. And tools. So click to install that. Get another green check mark when we're good to go. And under our models, we're going to create our trip log context. So models, add class trip log context. This is going to be the file that helps us interact with our database. And so we're going to have a constructor here and a table of trips. And so I'll kind of change this here. This is going to be a DB set of type trip called trips. Now this constructor is not happy with me because I need to inherit from DB context. And add that using statement up top. Everyone will get happy except for it still doesn't know what a trip is because we haven't made the class. So let's make the model of a trip. Add a class called a trip. And as we walk through this, you kind of saw what a trip was composed of when I was live demoing. There's going to be an ID. Mandatory destination, so I'll say prop tab string destination. This is going to be marked as required with an error message. Please enter a destination. You're going to have to bring in this data annotations namespace. And we can kind of set up to string.empty of a default. Let's set up an accommodation. Prop tab string. Let's see. Accommodation. Same thing, string.empty. It is required. Please enter an accommodation. Next up is a start date and an end date. So that'll be a date time object. So public date time start date get set. And this, we will allow nulls. You don't have to set a start date or an end date. Well, actually, we'll make it nullable. However, still required to enter a start date. So actually making this nullable sets it up so that you see a valid error message when you do your data validation. It'll actually work if you leave that question mark off, but you get a validation message that is not accurate, so we want to make that nullable. Copy that then, paste it for the end date. End date, please enter an end date. Now we come to the optional. And there were accommodations phone, like you're reading my mind, and your email, picking up on what I want to do. Make these nullable, get rid of those squigglies. And then we have some activities. So we'll say prop tab string activity 1 nullable, and then copy and paste that 2 more times for activity 2 and activity 3. So that's our trip model. These are the different parts, and you can kind of see this is an exercise in learning again view models and temp data. And so you could make one big page to enter this in and for like CRUD operations, but we're going to kind of break it up into a smaller, like a wizard step by step. Because of that, there's going to be many get requests and post requests that allow us to work with temp data. And so again, the architecture of this application is such that we can utilize view models and then show the benefits of both view models and temp data. So let's don't need to go ahead. We're not going to seed any trips. I've already wired up some trips into my database, but maybe just so that I can kind of show you this. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to pretend like I've never run my trip log. I'm going to delete this like I never had it on my machine. Okay, and if I do a migration now, call it initial migration, init. Let's see, unable to resolve trip log context. Let me fix my mistake. Of course, you have to add the service for the trip log context to your program CS. So let's do that. I just simply forgot the step. So in program CS, we're going to point our services. So after create add controllers with view, we need to do builder services add DB context. Now our connection string, DB context of type trip log context, and we need to add a using statement using Microsoft Entity Framework Core to bring that in. And what was the name of our connection string? We named our connection string trip log CS. So let's put that inside of our string. Close the curly, close the parenthesis, I should say, close the parens, 3 triple closes. And now let's run that command again. Okay. And so if we look at kind of what's going on, you know, we're able to build our trips table. And that's mainly what we're looking to do inside of our database that I went ahead and deleted. So let's do an update database. Get that database created and ready for trips. No seed data this time. If I refresh my databases, here's my trip log database. And here is my trips table. Again, trip log is the name of our database. And here in the context, we name the table trips inside of our database. And so we are set up working with Entity Framework code first to create our trip. Now on the home page, on the home controller, we want to basically list all of our trips out of the database. Well, there are no trips, but let's go controller, home controller. We don't need the logger. Don't need privacy or error. And what we need to do is bring in our context. Called context. Then on our constructor, we need to initialize our context. Right? Again, this underscore context is how we're going to make connection with the database. Then when we hit our index view, we're going to select star, so var trips, underscore trips to lists. So very simple link query to get all of our trips, return our trips to the view. And now in our view for the home view index, we want to go ahead and delete that and display our trips. Now we're going to have a list of trips, so we're going to have a model of trips on our home view. So you could do a model, by the way, lowercase m when you're declaring a strongly typed model, a list of type trip. Okay, now obviously that's what we will get. You could also say IEnumerable. The IEnumerable interface says that you can, it's something that you can iterate over. And so you can see here anything that you could iterate over or loop over. Since you can loop over a list, it is also a valid data type to say, you know, and a list implements IEnumerable. You often see IEnumerable for the type. Okay, then what we can do is maybe wire up a table bootstrap class of table striped with a table head. TR, TH, destination, start date, end date, accommodations, things to do. Destination, start date, end date. Things to do. T-body. And let's see, start date. We have it as a string, and if there's a start date, if there's an end date, if there's accommodations, trip in model, var trip dot singular accommodation, and there is no thing to do, it's dot let's see, destination, I think we called it activity 1. Something like that. Now this is going to be an empty table when we get there, but let's just see our table on the home page. Cool. And now we need a link to add our trip. So I'm going to have a trip controller. I need to add a trip controller. So under controllers, add a controller. Okay, and the method when we what we're doing here is we're adding a trip, and this is going to be our HTTP GET. And what you may have noticed on we're going to take in an ID for like page 1, page 2, or page 3. So there were many pages on the GET request, and so we're going to be able to use kind of the default routing to extract that out of the URL. So if I go kind of into here, we get trip controller add, and then the route ID will be like page 1, page 2, page 3. And so we're going to use this ID passed into that method to help us determine what we need to do in the event, and we'll set up a default value that is an empty string. Okay, and so next I just want to go ahead and hit this route. And so on the home controller, home index, let's get back to coding this link. So above my table, I'm going to code an anchor tag. The action is add. The controller is trip. And then here's our route ID. And call it, so we can just pass a number here. Its default is empty, but we could pass it, you know, page 1 maybe. And this will say add trip and make it look like a bootstrap button, class of button primary. Okay. And went ahead and rebuild. So it says trip / add / 1, and it took me here. It says the view add was not found. I didn't create the add view yet, but it did take me to the right route. Let me put in a breakpoint and let me start running it in debugging mode. All right, so I got my breakpoint here. Let me start with debugging so that I can, in fact, well, I know that it's getting there because it's telling me the view's not there. So if I click add trip, there it hits my breakpoint and it's looking for an add view. I could see that ID has a value of 1. So I am passing in my ID. And here, we're going to, based on the value of this ID, send the user to different views. Okay, and so we kind of have an ID of 1 coming in, so you want to send them to that view with that information of you know, what you're asking for in that first step of the wizard. And so we're getting close to actually working with the view model and to working with temp data. So we're almost at that point. We're just so far it's just been wiring up some basics. All right, so I'm going to add a folder here. By convention, this is the trip. Definitely got to name it that. And I'm going to add a view called add1. Add1. And so h1, welcome to add1. And so back on, I can close my home controller, back on my trip controller, you know, switch based on ID. And we'll do case of 1. Return to the view of add1. And then case of 2, add2. Case 3, add3. And then sure, default. Return to a view index home. Something like that. And let's format this. Highlight, Control KF. And let's put quotes around my strings here. Something like this. Now we don't need that return. Okay, so the string ID should come in. Case 1 should go to add1. Should take me to add1 here. So it should say welcome to add1. Click on add trip. It takes me to add1. Awesome. Okay, now again, there's going to be many steps in the wizard. There's going to be an add1, add2, and add3, and this is kind of where I can begin to explain this concept of a view model and how it can be beneficial to us. And so on the GET request, we're using the URL as part of you know, our GET request. And so based on our as GET request, however, on a post, we have to accept a trip. And so if I do an HTTP post, our method, our add method, you know, needs to accept a trip because we're going to be saving trip called trip, and let's bring it in our using statement. Okay, now a trip by the model, okay, the model is used for the database, okay, and that's so if I'm going to kind of begin to explain view models, a model is used to wire up the C# class to the database. So that's a very specific purpose. Again, this is entity framework code first. C# classes are wired up to tables in the database. And so you're going to have things in the model that are specifically for the database. A view model is what do we need the C# class to the view. Okay, so they're just kind of fundamentally for different purposes. The model is for the table in the database. A view model is used to wire up a C# class to a view, but this C# class that we created, if you're just creating a model, you know, you don't want to modify your model necessarily for what is the data you need in the view. Okay, so I would just start off by saying, like, simply put, you know, models are for the database and view models are for a different purpose. And so, you know, as we're learning this, you know, for the first time, you might think that a model can be used both for the database and the view, and it can, but sometimes you might need different data in the view that doesn't line up exactly with your model class for the database. Okay, so here when I started to add a trip, let's take a look at the problem that this has, right? So this trip is coming from at this point the front end, and they're going to click on post, and I just want to show you the problem that kind of comes up. So back in my index, add one. Okay, we're just going to have a form. We'll get this posting. ASP action is add. And let's just put a button. Submit. I think it says next to take us to our next step in our wizard. Okay, and so again, I'm going to have to refactor this. I just want to show you the problem that exists if I say the model is a trip, not a list, but this is a single trip at this point. Let's hit the post so that we can see the problem with accepting a trip here. Okay, so we go to add trip, we hit a breakpoint, right? We know that breakpoint is good, so we hit continue. That sends us here. Here's our button to kind of step us through the wizard. Okay, now I'm accepting a trip, and you can see what fields this trip has. It has an ID of 1. This is the trip ID, and right now everything is empty. It's an empty trip. Okay, but if I want to use one method, right, to kind of step us through what I don't have here, what I don't have on this one method, presuming we want to use one method, you know, every time through, like we're using one method on all of our get requests. I want to use one method on all of my post requests. I don't want to create a bunch of different methods. On my get request, you can notice I do have like this ID that I can do different things based on the case of the ID. What is the value of the ID, 1, 2, or 3? Okay, and in trip, I actually don't have a way of knowing, is this the first time they click next, the second time they click next, or the third time they click next? Again, there's other solutions to this problem, but what we basically need to store is that piece of data on the view, this, hey, this is step 1, or this is step 2, or this is step 3. We need to store that in the view. Therefore, right? Therefore, there's the case for the view model. There's a piece of data that we need to store in the view, okay, which is, again, what step of the wizard is this? And we need to store that in the view so that when we post it, we can receive it on the back end and then kind of make our decisions based on conditional type situations that we did before. So that's the case for the view model. There's a piece of data that we need on the view that it's not there. So how do we fix it? Well, it kind of starts back here on the add method of the get. We need to send a view model into the view. Besides just going to add one, we need to say, okay, we're going to go to add one and we're going to send a view model. So again, all the view model is going to hold is just a trip in this case, and one more piece of information that is the page number. Okay, so let's go here under our models. We're going to say add a class trip view model. And so this view model is pretty simply, it's going to have a trip called trip, and it's going to have a page number. So I'm going to say public int page number get and set. And so this is just very simply, this is going to help us store an additional field that doesn't exist inside of a trip. Now you could say, well, I'm just going to go back to my trip model and add a page number, but you don't need to store page numbers in the database, right? So this view model would be used in our view to kind of send that into the view so that when you post it, you can use that page number to determine what to do. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And we can kind of initialize this as a new trip to kind of get rid of that compiler green squiggly. So here's our trip view model. Back on our trip controller, we could do var VM is our view model equals new trip view model. And we're going to say VM dot page number equals 1. Okay, now and again, we're going to go to the add one view and we're going to send in our view model. So we need to change our page 1 to accept a trip view model, and we need to store that page number in a hidden field. So the value is not the correct one. We need ASP4 helper tag. And this is at model, capital M. Actually, you don't need the at model. You can just say page number. So that's going to help us store that page number here. Okay, and so now back in our trip controller, instead of accepting a trip, we can take a trip view model. We'll just call this VM. So again, we're kind of sending this page number of 1 in. And now if I put my breakpoint in here, click add trip, let's hit continue because we know we're getting to here. Welcome to add 1. Click next, hover over my view model. Now you see I've got a page number being sent into this post, and I can use that page number again conditionally. I've said that 10 times. So there, awesome, view models. Let's finish out the add one. And so we're gonna have some div div with some margin and a label. Okay, so now we have to use this dot notation to get into the trip, the trip inside of our view model. So it's trip view model, trip destination. And so there's 4 fields here. There's accommodation. This will say accommodations. This will be start date, so I'll paste another one. And copy that for my end date. Okay, so I should still have my post, so I'm going to take that off of there. Let's put some data in and make sure that it's being received by our post. Got a date field thanks to. Okay, so that hits our post, and in our view model we now have a trip, and I've got an end date and a start date. I've got an accommodation of 2 and a destination of 1. So that was silly inputs of mine, but those are the 4 fields that are coming across correctly. Okay. Now, temp data is kind of the next concept, and we don't need to add a trip to the database. Let me go to my trip controller. And we kind of start with an if statement. So we'll say if and VM page number is 1. That's the first thing that we set it to. We set it to 1. We're going to load up some storage in temp data. Temp data. So this is going to, temp data is a way for data to persist across get and post requests. Of course, HTTP is stateless, so you need a way to kind of store. Temp data is one way to store data across get and post requests, because every time you're going back and forth between get and post, the server is forgetting all about the client. So we're going to save our temp data sub. Again, what fields are there? There are the, if I look at a trip, destination, accommodation, start and end date. So my first temp data here, temp data sub destination equals my VM trip destination. Looking good. Start date and end date. So this is writing these fields into temp data. So this is again kind of allowing data to persist. And I'm going to return redirect to action is good. Add new ID of 2. Okay, so this is going to put me back to a get request after storing these in temp data. Okay, so back to my add method. That's add 1 and close that, close program. Okay, so I scroll back up. This is going to send case 2 in. I just need to send Let me send in the value of 2. Yeah, ID of 2. So it should come in 2, should return me to view add 2. Okay, so now it's rinse and repeat. This is going to be vm.pageNumber is 2 once we hit here. And that will send me to add 2 with the VM here. And so I need to make add 2 inside of trip, add a view, add 2. It is a lowercase model trip view model. I'm going to say welcome to add 2. Of course, I'll change this up appropriately, but let's walk through the steps. Just like before, we're going to have to kind of... Okay, so we're hitting add 2. So I go to add 2. Get rid of that. Same thing, form, ASP action is add. And a hidden input type of hidden to store the ASP for the page number. And a little bit of space on our divs. We're going to say label ASP4 trip dot phone number. Class is form label. Okay, copy that for the phone number, paste it, and the email. Combination email, combination email. Okay, and a button for next. So button type of submit, class is button. Okay, so that's going to allow us to post. Anytime you're in a form, you're going to do a post. I think method is post. Did I do a method of post on the first one? I didn't, but you would expect it to. Method is post. So let's, I think my breakpoint is still in there. Add a trip. Okay, it's hitting my post. Page number is 1. So it still hits my post. Takes me to page 2. Hits my post again. Now my view model. Okay, now it has those fields, which we're going to load up in TempData. Notice our view model, of course, it doesn't have the fields from before, like the destination, the start date, or anything like that. Right, but it should have a page number of 2, else if VM page number and let's load those 2 up in TempData. All right, and now we redirect to the next return redirect action, redirecting to action 3, which is going to go here. Send that VM in. VM page number is 3. Cool. And now what? We need add 3. Because add 3 view does not exist. So let's go trip, add class, add 3. Oop, not a class. Delete that. Add a view. Add 3. App model. Trip view model. And on add 3, couple fields. Form, ASP action, add, method is post. Again, it kind of worked without that, but I like it. Input type, I think my Visual Studio needs to be rebooted. ASP4, page number. I don't know, kind of. Last is activities. So these are not trip.destination. Activity 1. Activity 1. Call it activity 1. Activity 2. Activity 2. Activity 2. Okay, so that's that. Button submit, and this will be where you save the trip. And so this is the kind of final submit on your post. You should get, you know, else if I'm really just doing else, there shouldn't be anything else in there. Page number is now 3. We're going to say var trip or trip equals new trip, and destination temp data destination to string, accommodation to string, start date, we need to convert it to a date time, looking good, end date, accommodation email should be in temp data, accommodation phone should be in temp data, looking good. So just making sure these keys match: phone, email, end date, start date, accommodation. We're converting to the right types. Then what's left is our activities, right? Activity is coming in on the view model. All right, so we're posting in a view model from this last view. Activity 1, activity 2, activity 3. So that's our trip. And so let's save that with underscore context. We don't have our context in here, right? So we need to bring in our DB context. So private read only trip underscore or trip context called underscore context, public trip controller, initializing underscore context, underscore context, trips add trip. Now all of this, didn't do any data validation on this, so I can add that in. So you know, here I don't want to do this if the data isn't valid. So before I actually run this, I will add the trip and save changes, But let me do a little validation in the controller. And so here, if model state is valid, we do this. Else, return to the view, add 1. So this will take us to add 2, otherwise go to add 1. Now these are optional, so no need for that there. And on page 1, we can add a div ASP validation summary all. Do a class of text danger and do a closing div because that's here, and I'll take that outside of the form. Should be correct. Okay. That should bring us to an end if this is correct. I didn't make any other typos, which I probably did. So let's say St. Louis, Hyatt. Sometimes you get lucky and it all works. Oftentimes I make typos. Got it. So I got to redirect somewhere else besides add. I want to redirect to home, right? So I didn't, at the last one, I didn't send me to the right trip controller. Let's go return view, index, comma, home. So that'll send us to the right place once we save a trip. But it was saved to my database, and when I go to the right location, it is working. And so, yeah, just wanted to do that one. Hopefully it wasn't too long, just under an hour, and it kind of hit on those two topics of temp data, being able to send data from a controller post to another controller post. So controller to controller sending data. Now once you read temp data, it's kind of wiped out. There's a little more to it, but those are the basics. Same thing with the view model, just kind of hitting the very different purposes of what is a model for and what is a view model for.